We're in Reno, Nevada, talking today to Elgen Long. It's Saturday, April 17th, 2004. Elgen is a world record holder for flights around the world, a distinguished airline captain with Flying Tiger Line. And Elgen, let's start off by in your early years. Where were you born? Where did you go to school? And what got you interested in aviation?
Well, I was born at an early age. Anyway, I was born in McMinnville, Oregon. McMinnville is a town about 35 miles southwest of Portland. And my family were early settlers and pioneers in the Oregon country on both sides. Both my mother and father's side go back clear to the 1850s and 1860s. And I was raised, though, on a little coastal town called Taft at that time. There was a whole bunch of little towns, Cutler City, Taft, Bellscott, Devil's Lake, Ocean Lake. They all got together and made one big city they called Lincoln City, which was now the largest, one of the largest cities in Lincoln County on the coast of Oregon. And I tell you, a kid just couldn't have a better childhood. We had the lake, we had the bay, we had fishing, we had rocks, we had beaches. It was just a wonderful place for a kid to be raised. And that's where I lived until I was 10 years old. My folks moved us then down to Marshfield, Oregon, which is now called Coos Bay. And I went the sixth grade through the sophomore year of high school at Marshfield High School. And then World War II started. And it was quite a time in the United States at that point in time, and people were very patriotic. And my brother joined the Navy. We lived on the coast all our lives, and we felt that Navy was the thing to do. And he went down to San Diego, and I wanted to join the Navy. But I was only 15 years old. So my parents had to sign that I was 17 years old, and they let me go into the Navy at that age for a couple of reasons. One, I was very precocious, and two, I wasn't all that easy to control at 15, as you can imagine. And three, they thought my brother could take care of me if I went in the Navy and was down there at the same time he was. So on my 15th birthday, August 12th, 1942, I took the oath and went into the Navy and got on a troop transport and went down, a troop train, and went down to our little old place in San Diego called the Naval Training Station. And then one of the very lucky things in my life happened. I had a company commander named Mr. Mickety, and I was one of 150 men that he had lined up in front of the barracks. And Mr. Mickety said, "Everybody that can type, take one step forward." I took one step forward, and I was all by myself. I was the only one of 150 people that knew how to type. My father had a typewriter, and he had a typing book. I'd kind of taught myself, and then I'd taken a year in high school of typing, and I was a pretty fair typist. And he said, "Okay, you're company yeoman." Well, I didn't realize at the time that company, I was later told you never should volunteer for anything, but I'm certainly glad I volunteered for typing and be company yeoman. Because at the end of our training, I found out Mr. Mickety was not only just training the people, he was also judging them. And so he said, "Okay, you're typing up all the orders, so I know you'll type up yourself where you want to go, so why don't I work with you on it, and we'll select something." And I said, "Well, I always wanted to be a pilot, and I think I'd like to go to flight school." He said, "No, you don't have enough education for that. They won't accept you. You gotta have a year or two of college at that point in time," and I wasn't even a high school graduate. But what else you got in mind? I said, "Well, I was always interested in radio. How about aviation radio man? Yeah, that we can do. Where would you like to go to school? And I said, well, where are the schools? He says, well, there's one right here in San Diego, and there's one back in Memphis, Tennessee. I'd just soon stay in the West Coast. I'll go to the one here. He said, okay, fine, type up your orders. So I became an aviation radio man, went to radio school, gunnery school, radar school, a whole bunch of schools for about 6 months. And then I was shipped out. And I was shipped out to Headquarters Squadron, Fleet Air Wing 2 at Kaneohe. At that time it was a Naval Air Station, now it's a Marine Corps Air Station. And they decided I wasn't a good enough radio man for the fleet, so they sent me to advanced radio school, anti-sub warfare school, advanced gunnery school, and by the time 1943 rolled around, I was a well-trained aviation radio man gunner. And also later on I became a radar bombardier and also a navigator. That's another story. So I joined the squadron, and I was sent down to the South Pacific with VP-34, which is a PBY squadron. And the VP-34 was a Black Cat squadron, and we had quite a interesting trip down to the South Pacific. I came back off VP-34, and I was transferred to a Coronado squadron.
Did you fly down to the South Pacific in the PBY?
Yeah, we flew down through the island hopping. We went to Palmyra, Canton Island, and Phoenix Group, and we were flying patrols out of there for several months. And when we rotated back to Kaneohe, I was transferred to a PB-2Y3, a Coronado squadron, which is a new big seaplane. Matter of fact, it was the biggest plane I'd ever seen in my life. And I went to VP 102, and we went down to the South Pacific, or the Central Pacific, I should say. We went down to through Johnston Island, the Marshall Islands. We went to Kwajalein, and we were at Ebi at Kwajalein, and Perry Island at Eniwetok. Flying patrols out of those places, and bombing Ponape and other Japanese installations like Woji and where the Japanese were holding out. We didn't clear out all those islands. We island hopped. That is, I should say, the Naval Command, the military didn't bother to conquer all the islands. They just captured the ones that they thought were important and left the others more or less just to starve to death. Then we moved up from Eniwetok, and I want to just say at Eniwetok we were at Perry Island, and it was called the East Channel, which is right at the end of the island, and it was only about 150 yards wide. And in the lagoon, at that point in time, getting ready for the invasion of the Marianas, I remember counting 400 ships, all ships that were getting ready for that invasion. And I remember that over 40 of them, I don't remember the exact number, were aircraft carriers. If you can imagine 40 aircraft carriers in one place, it's hard to imagine. And then when they started leaving for the Marianas, they came out through the East Channel. And I remember going down there and watching the guys and waving to them. Some of them waved back. Sometimes there wasn't anybody on deck, but the ships were leaving for the Marianas, and it was a steady stream of ships all day long in order to get 440 ships through that channel. That was for the invasion of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. A week or two later, we moved up, just a few days after D-Day, we moved up to Saipan in the Marianas and operated the seaplanes off the Kenneth Whiting, which was our ship, and we operated offshore. We were about 2 miles offshore so that we'd be out of range of mortar and rifle fire, and it was off Sharon Kanoa, which was a sugar mill in Japan, just south of Garapan City. And we operated out of there for several months, and one of the planes had found the Japanese fleet and the start of the Turkish shoot, if you remember. And I met the radio operator off of the airplane that had found the fleet, and they had made up a coded message for him to send to headquarters about what they're doing, and he was scared to death. He sent the message. He thought they'd received it. They hadn't. And when they got to close range, where the pilot could use the command radio and could talk to the ship, he asked him, "Did you get our message about the Japanese fleet?" "What message?" And our radio operator was afraid that he was going to get a general court-martial out of it. He was scared to death. I don't think he did, but never could explain why they didn't get the message and why he thought he had received a Roger acknowledgement for the message. Anyway, that was just a little incident. We could sit there on our boats, and now the Japanese, they'd start swimming out to the airplanes and throwing hand grenades into the planes during the night. They got one of the admiral's planes. It was a PB-2Y2, as I remember, a little different. It was a sort of a transport for the admiral, and they'd left a skeleton crew on board while they were at watch at the buoy, and a Jap threw a hand grenade inside, and the plane started to sink, and they bailed out, and right away, as soon as the explosion hit, the weapons boats that from the ship came out with armed guards and Marines on board to see what the heck was going on. They picked them all up. Nobody was killed or anything. But the admiral's plane is still laying on the bottom of the ocean out there. The Japanese soldier managed to sink it. The Marianas, our main patrols were from Wake Island, Marcus Island, mainly Wake Island. Marcus Island was more out of Kwajalein. Marcus Island, up towards Iwo, and out in the Philippine Sea. It was one of the patrols out in the Philippine Sea that found the Japanese fleet. And we always came back, on the way back, if we hadn't disposed of our weaponry, our bombs, we would always bomb Pagan Island, which was about 250 miles north of Saipan, because there was a Japanese airfield there, and we'd bomb it every day and also take pictures. And every day the Japanese would fix the bomb damage and make the airport still usable. So we'd lay a string of bombs down. I'll never forget one time we were bomb pegging, and we did it at a fairly low altitude. And when taking our pictures, we came by this point of land, and the waist gunner said, "Hey, there's tracers coming by, and they're coming from that point of land over there." We hadn't dropped our bombs yet. We were taking pictures. And the captain, PPC, patrol plane commander, came around and headed for the point of land. And I can't imagine what the last thoughts of that Japanese machine gunner out there was when he saw this B-24. I mean, this PB-2Y3 empty all those bombs in the salvo at him. He picked the wrong day to do the wrong thing. It was a bad day for him. Saipan was finally secured, and we moved into Tanapig Harbor. We were able to go ashore, and we did have infiltration of Japanese soldiers during the night and whatnot, but nobody was ever killed, but some of the guards were wounded. The Marines and the Army was pretty much guarding us, but things became quite routine, and our airplanes were getting a little on the old and ricky-ticky side, so and some of our equipment wasn't, like the radar and whatnot, wasn't as good as we had ASD radar on the PB-2Y3s at that time. So we went back to the United States, and for about about 6 months, and they completely refurbished our airplanes, put all new radio equipments, and we got an ART-13 transmitter instead of the old G09, I think it was, and new radio receivers, all better equipment, much better radar. We got ASP-15 radars put in radar domes up on top, much better radars than we had before, and they called the modifications of it, they call it a PB2Y5 after that. Then we were brought out again, and this time we went right to Okinawa via the Mid-Pacific. We visited a lot of our old haunts like Johnston Island, Ebi, Perry, Saipan, and finally made our way into Okinawa. And things were really hot in Okinawa. We were still operating off the Kenneth Whiting, which was a seaplane tender, AV-10, I believe it was. And the Kenneth Whiting was kind of our second home. North Island was our first home down in San Diego, and the Kenneth Whiting, wherever the advanced route was our second home. The war was sort of winding down. Our patrols were mainly at night. We were interdiction patrols. The Japanese would move up the Chinese coast, and then they would move over to Korea, and then they would come across the straits from Korea to Japan in the middle of the night under the cover of darkness. Well, we had a good radar, and I'd actually been to radar bombing school by then, and we could attack them at night, so they didn't have any. Our job was to interdict them because that's where they were getting their supplies and whatnot. And we operated on the straits and all up down the coast of Korea, coast of China, and the Kyushu coast, where they try and go around and get into the inland sea. If they got into the inland sea, they were pretty safe because, especially in the daytime, there was a lot of anti-aircraft, still a lot of fighter planes and whatnot back on the home islands. So I remember when Ernie Pyle was killed. I don't know if people now remember who Ernie Pyle was, but he was a Dog Faces reporter, and he always made his reports not on what the officers were doing and what the command was doing, but he made his reports on what the ordinary soldier and what we call the grunts was doing. And he was a great favorite and a great reporter in World War II. And he was killed there on a little island right off Okinawa.
Okay.
We made most of those patrols up off of the Japanese islands, and we had radar countermeasures, which was super secret stuff. We only had 3 airplanes equipped with them, and they had the equipment installed on what we call the poop deck, and nobody was allowed, not even our own flight crew were allowed, but only the radio operator and the PPC was allowed on the poop deck. And they had a bunch of receivers in there and a bunch of pulse analyzers, oscillographs is what they were. And we would fly up along the coast, just off the coast of Japan, and we had receivers that had electric motors on them that kept sweeping the bands from one end to the other. And we would find a radar. Then they had a book, and from the pulse recurrence rate and the frequency and whatnot, they could tell what kind of radar it was, whether it was an anti-aircraft radar, a coastal search radar, or a ship's radar. And if it was a ship's radar, they could actually tell you what kind of ship, and because they were all a little different, and they knew how to analyze that. Well, we would also, on the search radars, we would find holes, and they were where the radar wasn't as good as it should have been. We had a signal strength meter where we could go in and we could tell whether they were receiving us back or not, and by the signal strength. And we could also tell if there was a gap somewheres, and then we would plot that all out, and then they would send the B-29s in through the gap. And if they had high altitude anti-aircraft radar, we would send the B-29s in a way to avoid that. We were doing a lot of pretty high quality intelligence for World War II. I'm talking 1945, and I'm talking radar countermeasures. Also, they would send Irving twin-engine night fighters up after us, and we'd spot them. We'd spot the radar, and we could see them. They had fixed radar. They had to turn the whole airplane to make the radar work. And we'd see them searching for us, and then when they find us, and then they start in on us. Well, then we'd throw out a bunch of chaff and turn. And then they would, a few minutes later, fly into all the chaff, and we were gone. And then they'd see them searching for us again. We'd repeat this all night long. None of our airplanes were shot down by the Irvings. We did have one airplane shot down by a ship, but most of the airplanes we lost were through accidents, and I want to mention 2 typhoons we had in Okinawa. One, the first typhoon, was about 115 mile an hour winds, and I rode it out on the Kenneth Whiting. The second typhoon was about 200 miles an hour, and nobody rode it out anywhere. Anybody that got caught by that typhoon, including all of the Quonset huts and the fleet post office and everything else in Okinawa, got wiped out. It was one of the strongest typhoons on memory there, and it is said that the whole island of Okinawa was covered with about 3,000 tons of fruit cakes and cookies that had been sent from home when the fleet post office blew away. Well, anyway, we operated out of there, and the end of the war was coming along, and then came Nagasaki, or I should say, then came Iwo Jima. First bomb at Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki, and that was the end of the war. The Japanese decided to quit the war, and so we had a ceasefire. And I remember the date of the ceasefire because that was the day that we were sent out of Okinawa down to Formosa, Formosa being Taiwan. And we went down to Formosa, and our job was to find Japanese military installations, buzz them, and see if they'd shoot at us. And I remember at the time thinking, you've got to be young and stupid to be doing this. I remember one time we went down this airfield, we went right down the runway about 5 feet off the deck, having a lot of fun in our own way, and there was a whole row of, these were Irvings too, the twin-engine night fighters, and their engines are running, and the pilots are in the cockpit. They were shaking their fists at us. Nobody fired at us. And then the thought flashed through my mind, darned if I want to be the last person killed in World War II. Anyway, that was the end of the war as far as that was combat was concerned. We were probably the first crew of the first squadron that was stationed in Japan after World War II. The Kenneth Whiting met us at Sasebo, and we operated out of there, and the Kenneth Whiting was the first capital ship to go into Sasebo Harbor, which is a major Japanese, now are still a major naval base. And it had 3 other minesweepers went in with it, one in front and one on each side, sweeping the channel for mines, and went in and they set out the buoys, and we operated out of there for a while. And we were flying over Nagasaki about, 2 or 3 weeks after Nagasaki was bombed. We didn't know any difference, so we were buzzing the place and flying all around at low altitude. And I often wondered about, if we had exposed ourselves to how much radiation in doing that. We didn't really know that much of anything about radiation at that point in time. Then we moved, the Kenneth Whiting moved us down to Hong Kong. And that was a wonderful experience. I can remember a Hoagie Carmichael song. He had 20 years privilege taken away from him because he kicked old Buddha's gong. this is now 1945, and I remember we had Thanksgiving there because I still have a Thanksgiving Day menu from the ship, the Kenneth Whiting. So we were there Thanksgiving Day. We flew patrols there down to the South China Sea, to along the Chinese coast south down towards Vietnam and Burma. Well, not Burma, Vietnam, and we just they didn't know what else to do with us, so that's what we did. Also, we would pick up coast watchers. Admiral Buckmaster, when he was Captain Buckmaster, he was captain of the carrier sunk at the Battle of Midway. I'm trying to remember, Yorktown. He was captain of the Yorktown, and we flew him up to, I believe it was Amoy, and as soon as they went ashore, because they were supposed to pick up a naval chief who'd been sitting there as a coast watcher, using the direction finder and keeping track of the Japanese shipping that was going up. That's how we knew they were going up the coast at night, because coast watchers like him were keeping track of them. And we were picking him up. So we landed out in the middle of the river there, Harbor River, and tied up to a regular big ship's buoy, and sat there and waited for a boat to come out. And a sampan came out, and the admiral and our PPC and all the officers went ashore, but the enlisted men stayed aboard the airplane. No sooner had they disappeared in around the jetty into the harbor area, and another sampan came out, and here was a naval chief, and with March of 52, I went on the seniority list, and he gave me a check ride at Van Nuys Airport in a C-46, which was a huge airplane for me at the time. And I took off. Takeoff was okay, and then the landing was okay. But after the landing, I was zigging and zagging from one edge of the airport to the other. And this was down to 10-mile-an-hour speed, and I was still going zigging and zagging. And Bob Martin got laughing so hard, and I'll never forget this. He was laughing so hard, his tears were coming down his eyes. He said, "I've never seen anything like it in my life. Why don't you just let go of it? You're doing all that." So the second time it turned out a lot better, and the third time it was halfway decent. So I qualified as COA. I didn't know how to fly, and I have to say, as a co-pilot flying C-46s for the Flying Tiger line for the next 5 years, I got the best training anyone ever got in the world from the captains of the Flying Tiger line, who were, half of them were part of the AVG, American Volunteer Groups, that had thousands of hours in DC-3s and C-46s and that type of twin-engine, tail-dragging airplanes. A lot of them, other ones, had been through right here in Reno, Nevada, up at Stead Air Force Base. They'd learned to fly C-46s up there, and they'd flown C-46s for years. They're really old hands, and I was very interested in being the best pilot I could, and boy, I got the best 5 years of training anyone could get, being co-pilot to these really great guys. And when you show interest, they turned around and showed interest to you. We became the darndest band of brothers you'd ever see in your life. I worked for the Flying Tiger line for 41 years, and I retired in 1987 at age 60, mandatory because of the FAA. And here it is now, 2004, 17 years after I retired. Week after next, I'm going down to Long Beach. We're all getting together and have a big reunion we do every year. And it's wonderful. We are a band of brothers, and it was a Commodore ship that takes either a war or a long time together to develop. Flying Tiger line was one of the most wonderful organizations to work for, you can imagine. Everybody in it was putting their shoulder to the wheel and doing the best they could to push it. They eventually, in 1989, I like to say, well, they started about a year before I went to work for them, and they ended a year after I left. So I guess I must have been responsible for all the success. That's a joke. I just enjoyed working for them. I made good money. They always paid top dollar, and they treated us as individuals, as human beings. And right from the top, Bob Prescott, Fred Benninger, all of the people there were just great to us. And Prescott would always, he'd take care of his boys. Why not? But we worked for it too, and there were some hard times. When I went to work in the C-46s, I was soon qualified in the DC-4 as well, maybe 6 months or 8 months later, and I was qualified in both the C-46 and the DC-4. We had an operation to start the dew lines up in the Arctic. And we, the British, Canadians would not allow American carriers. Western Electric had the contract, if I remember correctly, to, maybe it was Westinghouse, I don't remember. Anyway, whoever was to build the dew lines. And we had to start we bought a Canadian outfit called Queen Charlotte Airlines, and we became Queen Charlotte Airlines. We took our C-46s and DC-4s that were going to fly up there and painted out the Flying Tiger line and painted on Queen Charlotte, put it on Canadian registry, and we had to go up and take examinations for Canadian licenses and get a work permit and all that good stuff. So we went up to into the Northwest Territories. We were at Edmonton, but mostly we were at Yellowknife and Hay River on the Great Slave Lake, flying out of there. And we were flying up into the Arctic Circle, the District of Franklin, Cambridge Bay, and all the various sites. And it's kind of interesting the way they started. There was no dew line. There wasn't anything there. And the way they started, we were starting the sites, and the way they did it is they would send a D8 cat with 2 sleds behind it, one sled full of fuel and the other sled with a tent and some supplies for it, and a cat driver and a Eskimo. And they were supposed to go wherever this site was supposed to be. And most of the sites were on the water because it had to be, because we had to land on the ice. There was no runways anywhere or anything, and everything had to be flown in. So in the wintertime, there was ice and you could land it. Even C-124s land on the ice in Cambridge Bay. C-46 and DC-4 was fine. And we would go in, and when the cat got to where the Eskimo said that's the place where they want to build the site, then he would take his D8 cat and scrape out about a 4,000-foot runway about 50 feet wide, and sastrugi and knock it all down and whatnot, make a decent runway out of it. They would take all the empty fuel drums and set them on each side of the runway, because everything was just pure white, ice and everything, but these black barrels would show you where the runway was. They had no radios. There was no way to navigate up there. It didn't even have a compass. I know, this sounds almost impossible. We navigated up there with it, because this is near the magnetic pole, and there just isn't any compass. We didn't have any Loran. We didn't have any way to navigate. There was an old joke about we could tell where north was by pointing the hour hand on our watch towards the sun, and then 12 would be north. I'm not sure whether that was the way you did it or whether you knew where north was, and then you looked what time it was and you could find your watch. It was one of those things. I can't remember exactly what it was all about. But navigation was there. And no weather. We didn't know what the weather was, where it could be foggy. We'd go out there and wander around trying to find it. Sometimes usually we managed to find the place. No homers, no beacons, no nothing. No compass. And sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we found the wrong place. We had a DC-4. Bill, Bill Patterson landed a DC-4 at an Eskimo village. He thought it was an airfield. He just landed out in the middle of the snow. Believe it or not only did he not crash the airplane and landed it, but when he opened the door, all these Eskimos, ugh, glug, you know, what do we do? They couldn't speak English. He didn't know where he was. They couldn't tell him where he was. So he had to get out of there. So he kicked all the fuels and everything out. Boy, the Eskimos, they had a field day. All these 55-gallon drums of fuel were being loaded, unloaded. Anyway, he went back and forth, and he knocked down enough of the runway. He got that DC-4 off, if you can believe it. Landed, you know, an open field landing, and got it airborne again. Anyway, we thought he was goner because he didn't show up for a long time. But we did have radios on the airplanes. We could talk to Cambridge Bay, a place called Contoita Lake, and Bathurst Inlet. They had radios. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had radio stations there. We established those sites about every 100 miles. Well, actually, about every 50 miles between along the Arctic Circle up there to watch for Russian airplanes coming over the top, and they were putting them close enough together where they even nap of the earth they couldn't get through without being spotted. All we were doing was establishing the runway, we'd fly in some modular buildings mainly for barracks. And that would be only, and then they eventually established radio stations and had homers, and you know, life was good then. But it took several months, and we were doing this all in the middle of winter because you couldn't fly up there in the summertime because the ice would melt, and that's what the ships were supposed to come in. But they had to get a base for the people to work on when the ships came, because the ships had to come in right out and get right out again because and then we had to get the base started. So they got these bases started. We operated all the way from Alaska, I think the name was Perry Point, all the way to Shepherd's Bay, which is Site 10 to Site 24. And that was called the Mid-Canadian Mid-Dew line, and we operated between those two extremes. There was another group of C-46s and DC-4s operating out of Hudson Bay, and they serviced from Site 24 on over to the Greenland area. And then there was another group. Well, I don't know. We didn't in the U.S. I guess it was Alaska Airlines or somebody was handling that. I never knew who they were. But that went on all that winter. And we lost quite a few airplanes, but Flying Tiger Line was very fortunate. We never lost anybody. No one was killed. We lost a DC-4. We lost a couple 3 C-46s. Unfortunately, another Canadian outfit that was flying right along parallel with us, they were flying Yorks. The York was a modification of the 4-engine Lincoln. I think it was Lincoln Bomber or Lancaster, I can't remember what. Anyway, the York was a modification of that allowed it to carry cargo and whatnot instead of bombs. And they lost whole crews and they lost a lot of people and a lot of airplanes. It was unfortunate, but it was a dangerous kind of flying. And there was no rules. There was nobody was going to be blamed for anything. You just bit off whatever you think you could chew. We didn't pay attention to weight and balances or how much we weighed or anything. We'd fill it full of gas, put all the freight we could get on it, and in the cold, you could get away with that in the cold air. And up there, we were flying at density altitudes below sea level, and the airplane performed very well. We were able to get, on the C-46, we were able to get much more than the usual 2,000 horsepower out of it. With those cold temperatures and the manifold pressure, 35 or 36, I can't even remember what MAP was for takeoff on a C-46. But whatever it was, we were getting another couple hundred horsepower because of the cold air. And that all helped. And of course the wings had heavy air to work on. That came to an end, and as you well know, the DEW line was successfully built and operated for, I guess, 30 or 40 years, and then I understand now it's, the sad part of it is probably that was the end of the Eskimos' way of life, because we ruined them by bringing in the fuel and the guns and the
Booze.
I'm sorry?
Booze.
Yeah, booze and all the good stuff of culture, of the modern culture. And that was, at least as far as northern Canada, that was pretty much the end of the Eskimos' old way of life. Well, that wasn't the end of the Flying Tiger line by a long shot. We got DC-6s about then, DC-6As. We bought 5 of them, which was a huge buy for us from Douglas. Got them right out of the factory, brand new. Well, maybe it was even 7 or 8 of them, because we sold 5 of them to Western Airlines. We sold our position, and I think we got, I don't know, $100,000 a piece for our position, so they could get the DC-6s earlier than their competitor, United or whatever. We finally got our 6As though. I think we had 2 or 3 of them left over, and we didn't sell those. So now I had to get qualified in the DC-6. That was the first pressurized airplane I ever flew. And we, DC-6A, had a big cargo door in front. It was a nice airplane, pressurized. You could fly up to 20,000 feet to still keep the cabin pressure down to 8,000. But I was now qualified in the C-46, the DC-4, and the DC-6 at the same time. In 1957, we got Constellations. We bought 15 Super H Connies from Lockheed, freighter models. And the Connie was really quite an airplane. It was a very sophisticated airplane, and it was a Cadillac. It was a great airplane to fly, but it demanded attention, and it'd bite you if you didn't treat it right. And so now I'm qualified in the C-46, the DC-4, the DC-6, and the Connie. And you have to take a check ride every 6 months. I had to take a check ride every 6 weeks in order to stay qualified. I spent more time taking check rides than I ever did flying anything, it seemed like. But we didn't have any simulators or trainers in those days. We had the link trainers for instruments, but everything else, you had to take the airplane. You had to make a 2-engine landing. You made a 2-engine landing in a real airplane. And it got pretty dangerous up there. You go up and do your series of stalls and steep turns and stuff. Sometimes we'd do it if we had a ferry flight, and sometimes even when the airplane had freight on it. We'd go up and en route we would do this. I can remember a load of passengers doing a series of stalls in the C-46 one time. Anyway, it's hard to imagine, but that's the way it was. I can remember over San Jose one night, guy was getting a check ride. I was just deadheading down to Burbank, and we were just sitting there over San Jose doing stalls and steep turns and whatnot in this Connie. Anyway, thank God, the next airplane we got was the CL-44, and at least we had procedural trainers for it, and it was a turboprop and a jet type engine, not a piston type. And it was a great airplane. We had about 15 of them, and I flew those for about 5 years, till about 1960. And I'm guessing at this, I'd say 65. We bought some 707 320s, which was a freighter version of the Boeing 707. And I got checked out on that. And then about 1969, we bought about 15 DC-8s, BD-0626-63 models. That was a whale of an airplane. That was the stretch DC-8. It was a whale of a good airplane. So now I'm qualified. We finally got rid of the C-46s. I think the last C-46 flew in 1963 or something like that. And we finally got rid of the DC-4s, but now I'm qualified in the DC-6A, the Connie CL-44, and the Boeing 707. At least the 707, we had a simulator. We could take check rides in the simulator. We didn't have to go up and do Dutch rolls with a live airplane over San Jose. We could do it in the simulator. It was a lot safer and a lot cheaper. And we flew the DC-8 almost all first part of the Berlin airlift and the CL-44. I went to Japan and I flew out of Tachikawa Air Base, which was later closed, the CL-44s. And we only had about a 5,500 foot runway, and the jets couldn't go in or out of there. Might make it in, but they wouldn't get out. And the CL-44 could land and take off and that make the runway. And I remember flying the Stars and Stripes runs. I was actually based, we lived on the local economy there in Japan. And my wife came over and we lived there together for about 5 months. And I was flying what we call the Stars and Stripes run. I'd leave about 5 o'clock in the morning out of Japan, flying westbound towards Vietnam, arriving there about 5 hours later. But we picked up a couple hours because of the time zones, and we'd arrive there around early in the morning, and we'd have the Stars and Stripes that were printed in Tokyo for all the troops. And I had a whole plane load of them. They'd offload those, and then they'd go on to other airplanes, Buffalo and other airplanes that were going to the various little fields around Japan. They distributed. Then we'd pick up body bags to take back. And that was a very sad case. We'd bring them back to Tachikawa. And there they would be taken to Yokota Air Force Base or whatnot, put on C-130s or C-141s or whatever the Army would, the Air Force would do by then. I must mention, flying out of Tachikawa for many years, as I did, we had a civilian club there. They had a beautiful orchestra, and I have a 78 RPM, no, it's a 33 1/3 album record of the orchestra playing dance music at the civilian club. And the only trouble with the civilian club, as I remember, is that they had a white linen tablecloth 7-course dinner for $1. Unfortunately, they also had a bar that had martinis for a nickel. And I can't tell you how many times I went over to have dinner and stopped by the bar for a martini before dinner, and somehow or other they quit serving dinner at 9 and we'd never made it. Whatever. You got to be young and foolish, not stupid, but foolish. Flying Tiger Line got a bunch of 747s. I believe 4 of them, or 6 of them to start with. I can't remember which. 4 of them. And they were ex-American Airlines 747s. And we'd converted them for, I think, about $35 million each from passenger airplanes to freighters, and put a big cargo door in the back of them. And they put in sliding systems where pallets could be moved around by hand inside the airplane. And we bought those airplanes, and I got checked out. I went to American Airlines down in Dallas-Fort Worth area to their flight academy, took 747 training from the American Airlines people down there. And I got checked out in the 747 about 1977. I left something out. I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to back up to 1969. And the reason I'm going to back up is because we sold all of our CL-44s to a British company called Transmeridian London. And the airplane had never been certificated in England, and they had never flown it, and they didn't have anybody to instruct in it. So the company sent myself and a couple of other, one other pilot and a couple of pilots altogether, over with a couple of engineers and whatnot, and we were to train Trans-Meridian pilots and get them flying. Well, it was an extremely interesting experience, and again, we made a lot of good friends over there in England. We trained the pilots at Trans-Meridian London. I remember Mr. White was, I believe he was the chief pilot. I remember Kevin Keegan, he was one of the senior pilots. And I remember Mr. Keegan, his father, his brother, the older brother, who owned the airline. It was an individually owned company. And I was over there for about 6 months, I think. And luckily my wife was there with me most of the time, and the kids could come over and visit. And we'd take trips. I would go on check rides to do route checking, and I would take a new captain, and he would fly the thing, and I had to fly with him for 35 hours before he could be released to fly by himself. And I would take my wife along, and so we really had a lot of wonderful vacations in Kenya, and in those days Uganda. It wasn't very nice later, but it was nice there. Lake Victoria, Benghazi, Athens, Rome. It was quite a novel experience. And I had to get a British ATPL, airline transport pilots certificate to fly British airplanes. And not only that, I had the great pleasure to fly with Davies, HMB Davies, I think it is, or HMS Davies. Anyway, he was the chief test pilot for the British. He wrote the book Flying the Big Jets. He was a giant pilot in England, but he'd never flown a CL-44 either. So we had to do all the test flying to certificate the airplane. So he did the test flying. I sat in the right seat, and amazingly, a CL-44 was a very awkward airplane to fly. And I'd never seen anybody. He could nail an airspeed and hold it like I've never seen anything like it in my life. He was one of those naturals. And he was a great pilot. It was a great pleasure to fly with him. We got the airplane certificated and finally got the crews trained, and they could take over their own training after Mr. White and Mr. Keegan got enough experience to start training themselves. And we finally returned back to the United States. And now I'll go. Before we went, we were sent on a cruise, and it happened to be out of Southampton, and it was the premier cruise of the QE2. And my wife and I drove down and didn't take the boat train out of London or anything, so we beat everybody down there, and we were right waiting to get in the gangway when they opened up the gates to let people aboard. And when we checked in the purser's office with our green passports, our American passports, they said, well, you're the first Americans to board past each other on the QE2. And so we had a nice 7-day cruise down to the Lisbon and the Canary Islands and whatnot. And we were treated royally by the Cunard crew and everything. Those are just little side lights and little bonuses that you get for doing that sort of thing. Came back to the United States. The Vietnam War was going full blast. That's when we did the Chinese thing, the CL-44. That's when I was flying plane loads of DC-8 passengers from Travis Air Force Base, the old Fairfield Sassoon Army Base, to all the places in Vietnam. We served Da Nang, we served Bien Hoa, Cameron Bay, Tan Son Nhut. We flew troops and supplies into all of those places. And then we got this, about 1977, I got to start flying the 747, and I want to tell everybody that'll listen, I've flown a lot of airplanes, and I've got over 40,000 hours, pretty close to 40, somewhere between 40 and 45, and I think it's closer to 45. And I've flown a lot of airplanes, and I never flew an airplane that was as easy as to fly as the 747 was. I want you to know that Boeing sure knows how to build airplanes for old men. It was a great airplane. It always did exactly what it was supposed to do. It just was very forgiving, and just a great airplane to fly. It was a little bit awesome when you first got into it because of its size, but after a while you got used to that, and you really didn't pay that much attention to it. The 747 we operated into Vietnam as well, and then we continued to fly we expanded the MAX flights, 747. We flew average of 414, we had 414 seats. We flew 414 passengers on the MAX flights from St. Louis to Oakland, California, to Anchorage, Alaska, to Yokota Air Force Base, to Okinawa, and to the Philippines. And we did that for a number of years. In fact, that's then when time came to retire, I was #1 captain flying Tiger Line and enjoyed my choice of everything. Those guys in front of me, they enjoyed it for a lot longer than I did, but I enjoyed it while I had it. So crew control asked me, what do you want to do for your last flight? I said, well, you know, I've spent most of my time flying in the Pacific and Europe and whatnot, and Middle East and Asia. How about South America? We have a flight that goes down there out of New York. Why don't you let me PAX to New York or Deadhead to New York, and I'll fly a trip out of there. By the way, along the way there, we had picked up Seaboard World Airways. We bought them and their 747s and their CL-44s and DC-8s. And that was basically a New York run. So they made up a special run for me out of San Francisco to. I got to go down to South America and went to the Amazon at Manas, I think, and then down to Rio de Janeiro and on down to Argentina, Buenos Aires, all over South America. I just enjoyed it. And we had the #1 first officer, #1 captain, and the #1 flight engineer on that trip. When we did all kill ourselves, us old guys who were all set to retire. But that ended my career at the Flying Tiger Line. But I'm going to backtrack now just for a second. Well, there'll be more in a second, but I'm going to backtrack. In 1969, 1971, 2 years after having been in England, I'd been working with the idea that the world was ready for someone to fly around the world over the poles, solo. I didn't plan on starting with it solo, but it ended up that way. And because everything else was too expensive, and I couldn't find anybody that would help sponsor the flights. So my wife Marie and I put a loan on the house, and we sponsored it ourselves. The only airplane I could fly and afford to fly, and I could just barely afford that, was a Piper Navajo, which was a twin-engine, 310 horsepower, 8-place airplane that Piper made for executive travel, non-pressurized and everything, but it has turbo supercharged. And as long as I went by myself, we figured we could buy enough, we could afford the airplane and afford the fuel and all the stuff that goes with it. So in November 5th, 1972, I took off out of San Francisco, and I had received my sanction from the National Aeronautics Association and the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale to make it an official flight. I flew to Fairbanks, and then over the North Pole to Norway, and then to Sweden, down to London. And when I left San Francisco, my wife was there to bid fond farewell, I'm sure that my insurance was all paid up. And when I got in London, there she was. And she'd have turned out the press. We had a fantastic time. And we were guests of everybody and everything. I took off out of there then, and after about 2 or 3 days, we had to fix some radios and had some other work. But I had allowed a couple, 3 days there because I knew that'd be the last really good spot I'd have to, and I knew everything around London. So then I flew down to Ghana, and then from there after flying over the North Pole, my next place was the equator at the Zero Meridian out in the Atlantic, and went over to Recife and landed there. Then the next day I flew down to Rio de Janeiro, and guess who was in Rio to meet me? Marie was there, and she had turned out the press like you couldn't believe. There must have been 150 reporters and photographers there. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I couldn't believe it. But Rio gave us rolled out the carpet, and it happened that the maestro, Duke Ellington, was there, and they were staying in the same hotel, and so we got invited to the concert and backstage and the whole sphere. I mean, we were really feeling our oats, like we were important. So I took off. Was there a couple days. I had some of my equipment worked on again. I took off for Punta Arenas, Chile, on the Terra del Fuego, and as it happened, I stayed there a day or so, and then I took off for the South Pole and land at McMurdo. Now, that was all under the control of the Navy and the Antarctic Support Forces. The National Science Foundation was doing scientific work down there, and the Navy was supporting it. And they didn't want anybody down there. By coincidence, I was flying a DC-8 out of New York to Anchorage, Alaska one night, and I had 2 VIPs that were flying with us. It was a freighter, but we had a compartment where they could stay. And one of them was a fellow I knew from World War II. He didn't know me, but I knew him. His name was Arleigh Burke, and he was Chief of Naval Operations. And the other was his wife. And so I invited the Admiral up into the cockpit, and he rode the jump seat. He was interested. His wife went sound asleep in the back part. But anyway, he was going over to Korea for the inauguration of Governor for the Park, I think it was. Anyway, he was being installed as Prime Minister or whatever it was, whatever they did, President. And we were sailing over Alaska in the middle of winter and out in the middle of nowhere, and we were talking, and we were talking about World War II, and he was known as 29 Knot Burke because he got that nickname because he wanted to intercept the Japanese fleet in a narrow passage and have his own personal turkey shoot. But the command said he can't get there in time. He said, I can get there in time. And he had to average 29 knots to make it. And there wasn't a ship there that could do 29 knots, but he made it. And he had his great success. It was a great, successful battle. And that's how he got the nickname 29 Knot Burke. This is World War II I'm talking about. So I approached him about getting into Antarctica, and I said, can you give me some advice about how to approach someone in the Navy, a little bit of a loaded question, about how to, and he thought for a few minutes to get permission to go into Antarctica, and he said, well, I'll tell you this. He said, don't ask somebody that can only say no. In other words, if you haven't got the guy that can say yes, you're going to just get a no. And I thought that was pretty good advice. And he said, if you have any trouble, here's my card, give me a call. Well, about 6 months later, my wife and I were in Washington, D.C., trying to get permission from the Antarctic Naval Support Forces, who were, at that time, they later moved to Magoo, but at that time were stationed at the 10th Street Naval Yard. I could no more get in to see, nobody wanted to see me at all. They knew what I wanted, and there was no way they wanted any civilian flying down there in a little Piper airplane. So after trying for about 2 days to get in, I said, well, why don't we call Admiral Burke? He said, if you get in trouble, give him a call. So I called Admiral Burke's office, and his office was downtown. He was not chief of naval operations then. He was retired, but he'd been chief of naval operations. And he asked where we were. We told him what trouble we had. He said, well, come on over. We're only a few minutes away. Come on over, and I'll see what I can do. So we went over, and Marie and I entered his office, and he had an office as big as this house, and very impressive. And so he said, well, we told him we're trying to get permission to fly into Antarctica, and Captain Swinburne is acting commander of naval forces in Antarctica, and we're trying to get in to see him. We can't even get past the gate. He said, well, let me see what I can do. Florence, will you get me Captain Swinburne over at 10th Naval Yard? Yeah. How you doing, Buck? Yeah, how's Evelyn? Hey, listen, I got a couple young people here who want to see you. When could you see them? How long would it take you to get over there? About 20 minutes. About 20 minutes? Okay, fine. Hey, good luck to you. So we get in the cab, we race over there, and we're ushered into Captain Swinburne's office. Well, he's all set. He's going to say no. I mean, he can say yes, but he's going to say no. But he's got to be polite because Admiral Burke had asked him to see us. And so, but in order to have witnesses that he was very polite when he said no, he had Captain Swinburne and Navarrete, Captain Navarrete. And that was his operations officer. And they listened to our spiel, and they were having a hard time finding any reason to say no, because I'd really planned the thing and had it well thought out and well planned. Well, finally Navarrete said, well, listen, we got to think about this and check on a few things. We have our operations plan for next year. We got to go over that and make sure it fits in and whatnot. But where are you staying? In other words, it's going to take us a while to figure out how to say no to this guy without getting the admiral angry with us. And said, well, we're staying over in Crystal City with a friend of ours, Commander Almack, who's on the fighter desk over at Crystal in Virginia. Robert Almack? He's godfather to my children. Needless to say, we got permission to fly into Antarctica. As far as I know, I'm one of the few people that ever got permission to fly in, and you can see how it happened. It was just a blind luck and coincidences you couldn't believe.